So kind of gives you some stability.
Can you see that screen right there? Let me see. That's General Mattis. You can see that.
I'm gonna have some remarks here on behalf of Richard Lincoln, who we are all here to honor today. But before I do, I just want to take a moment. I'm Bobby Charles, and grew up in Wayne. I just want to take a moment and give you 10 seconds here of what I think is one of the most remarkable things that's happened in my life, to see a veteran from Wayne, Maine, who did some remarkable things that I will tell you about in just a moment, recognized before the United States as a whole, C-SPAN. This happened last Monday, this recognition that you're about to see. And it was an address essentially to the Army assembled, but to the Association of the U.S. Army in Washington, D.C. And this is the current Secretary of Defense, James Mattis. I want you to know I've never talked to James Mattis. I haven't even talked to Bill Cohen in the last 15 years. But somehow the words that some conversations that had occurred sort of ebbed up, and then there was some research done. You'll hear the research that was done on Richard and his career. I'm sure they went back to DD-214s and all those things to find out what it was all about. And what makes this so remarkable is that, I'll call you Richie if that's okay, Richie. Richie was involved in some of the most ferocious fighting that occurred in the European theater in World War II. He was involved in something called the Blue Devils that I'll tell you more about in a moment, the 88th Division of the 5th Army. And he was also a scout, actually a first scout. And there's real meaning to that. That meaning is known to James Mattis, because James Mattis is probably, if not the most decorated, one of the most decorated Marine Corps generals retired that is alive today. He is incredibly respected all over the world, never mind the United States. I think a lot of us feel very grateful that at this moment in American history, James Mattis is the Secretary of Defense. And now I want you to listen to his words spoken to the nation and to 5,000 people sitting in an audience in Washington, D.C.
I want to go back to World War II, the greatest generation. Today, as we sit here, there is a 91-year-old World War II combat veteran from Maine. The veteran is Mr. Richard Lincoln, and he's now living in a veteran's home in Maine. He and his 3 brothers all fought in World War II, and he is the last surviving one. Mr. Lincoln has a remarkable story. As a 17-year-old from a very small town of Wayne, Maine, a town of less than 1,000 people, and standing just 5 foot 5 inches tall, I wondered as I read that, was that the effects of malnutrition during the Depression? Mr. Lincoln served as a first scout in the 88th Infantry Division in the Battle of Anzio, which, as you all know, was a grueling and historically important amphibious assault in the Italian campaign, an amphibious landing against long odds which permitted the Allied capture of Rome. He repeatedly risked his life on the front lines to identify enemy artillery batteries, regularly enduring enemy fire and never shrinking from enormous dangers. The 88th became the first Draft D division to enter a combat zone in World War II. In 344 days of combat, the 88th Infantry Division lost 2,298 men killed in action and 9,225 men wounded. The Blue Devils, as they were called, proved that with rigorous training, sound teamwork, competent leadership, and fierce determination, an all-Draft D division was more than capable of fighting well against well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened enemy. When the Allies liberated Rome on June 4th, everyone wanted to be the first into Rome, but the all-Draft D 88th became the first division to enter the city. Although overshadowed by the Normandy invasion 2 days later, you all know the capture of Rome was a significant victory for the Allies. For his heroic service in that campaign, Mr. Lincoln was awarded the Bronze Star Medal, and on June 4th, 1944, the day when he and his fellow soldiers of the 88th Infantry Division entered Rome, Richard Lincoln turned 18 years old. Mr. Lincoln was and is today a humble, earnest, self-effacing man, grateful to be an American. He knows what it felt like to be shot at from very close range every day for months, since being a scout was about as close to the front lines as it gets. To this day, he wonders how he survived when so many comrades did not. He says he thinks it might have been because I was short, which is a wise point. I never envied tall men on the battlefield myself. But I would tell you, too, that Mr. Lincoln is one of those who created the legacy of the American Army, the most trusted, the most ethical, the most capable army in the world. One built on physically tough and tactically competent soldiers under NCOs and officers at the top of their grim game. From Shiloh to the Marne, from the Bulge to Pork Chop Hill, the Delta, and the deserts that this generation of soldiers have faced, when trouble loomed, the Army has always stood and delivered. So to all the veterans in the room, you set an uncompromising bar that every one of us on duty today must live up to. We know we will never face something worse than what you maintained your dignity and your honor throughout. So to every veteran in this room, to every Mr. Lincoln who's hailed from Maine to Hawaii, from Alaska to Puerto Rico, thank you for standing by the red, white, and blue.
So Richie, now we have some letters and a few remarks to punctuate what the Secretary had to say. And I will just be brief if I can and deliver a little bit of history to this group of Wayne assembled and others to honor you today. I'll also note that Richie is wearing on his lapel the insignia, the patch of the Blue Devils, the 88th Division, which were also so fierce and so stealthy in the way they operated in Italy that they were called, they were referred to as the Fighting Blue Devils. So the nutshell version is every once in a while, I think, in our busy lives, it's worth pausing and remembering that we're just dots along a line and that there were dots before us on that line that got us to where we're at. And it's really because of some conversations that occurred recently that this dialogue and this day are happening for you, Richie. This summer I made a discovery. Someone I had known all my life as a cheerful, thoughtful, lighthearted voice in the town I grew up in, Wayne, was something more than that. The service he gave this country as a young man, although he never talked about it except in a light way, was profound, daring, and as a matter of historical record, heroic. That person is Richard Lincoln, known to many in this town and in this room as Richie. He went to war in October 1943, 74 years ago last week. He and his three brothers joined World War II at once, and he was put in the U.S. Army's 88th Infantry Division. That division went into the 5th Army at Naples in February 1944. And I just want to note in overview that the Italian campaign did not get a lot of attention. And the reason it did not get a lot of attention is because Normandy and what was happening in France was understood to be underway. And the press, like today, was very interested in what they thought would be the big story. So if you read in the history books what the entire Italian campaign was about, they call it the Quiet War. Not because it was quiet, but because it was unrecognized for a long time as, it wasn't as front and center as Normandy. So this division that Richie was in, the 88th, went into the 5th Army at Naples in February of 1944. The division became known as the Blue Devils, and that referenced their shoulder patch, which looked similar to this. Indeed, this is one of the original shoulder patches right here that was worn by the Blue Devils. And it was also because the Germans, when they were captured, began referring to them as fighting like devils. They came out of nowhere. The division was invariably successful, although it often took a long time, and the Germans feared them. Indeed, they were the most feared division of the 5th Army. They objectively, and I say to you, just go online and Google it, and you will find clips. They have been sanitized, but these clips will show you how ferocious the battle was that was waged in Italy from Naples forward. By mid-April of 1944, the Allies and the Germans had more than 20 divisions in Italy. They actually had about 22 divisions each in Italy. From May 11th forward, the Blue Devils led the way for the Fifth Army, the advance north. And if you look at a map of Italy, you'll see Naples is quite a ways to the south. It's not near the north. They went in at Materno. They fought at Materno. They beat the Germans there, pushed them back to Formia. They beat them there, and then they waged one of the most ferocious battles. Historians say the most ferocious of the European theater at Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino took 4 assaults. They were all horrific. They were extended in time. They bombed heavily the Monte Cassino monastery because they believed the Germans were lodged there, which they were. But it took everything they had to dislodge the Germans from Monte Cassino. Indeed, there is a movie made about it. You can go watch the movie. I can't remember who the actors and actresses are, but it's a big movie because it was so vicious. And when they took Monte Cassino, with the Blue Devils leading the way, they broke the Gustav Line. That was pivotal because it broke the German morale in Italy. The Germans, when they backed up to a city, fought from that city. Again, they would fortify and fight from that city. So from Cassino, they moved north. They took Spigno, then Mount Civita, then Itri, then Fondi, and then Roccagorga. Eventually, they came around and supported all the men at Anzio. Anzio had been an impossible breakout. They had tried to break out repeatedly. If you look at the numbers of dead trying to break out of Anzio, you will be shocked. They would send 600 men forward and dozens would get back. That's how vicious it was. So they couldn't get off the beaches of Anzio. And Richie this summer spent considerable time telling me earlier on in the summer and in late spring about some of the events that occurred, sort of flowed out of him that had occurred at that location at that time. And it was a pretty vigorous effort. On May 29th, the Blue Devils and the Fifth Army broke out of Anzio and pushed the Germans back. If you look at a map, it's about 20 miles. It's very rugged terrain. This is not like on June 6, 1944, the Allies went into Normandy, horrific battle, but by August 23rd, they're in Paris. This was different terrain. This is not flat terrain. This is very mountainous terrain. And they fought their way, they pushed the Germans back into Rome, and as the Secretary of Defense noted a moment ago, they took Rome on June 4th. Now I want to say a word about Richie himself. Richie was a scout, and when I first started talking about that to him several years ago, and then earlier this summer, he corrected me, he was a first scout. I'd never fully understood that until I began to look up what is a first scout. It turns out that in today's moment in the American military, a first scout is now a spec ops position designator in the Rangers. It is a very dangerous position, and in Vietnam, although the designator rotated with the unit, where's Steve? In any event, in Vietnam, you would be called on point, right? Well, in World War II, the first scouts had 2 roles, and Richie was a first scout his entire duration from Naples north. They had 2 roles. At night, they would go to the front lines and they would put up illumination. They would put up flares that would then drift down and illuminate the artillery and the troop strength of the military at the front line, of the Germans at the front line. Of course, it also illuminated them. And so they ran like heck, right? And they, as Richie said to me, he told me, you could hear the bullets on both sides. I hid behind rocks, trees, anything, pebbles, in order to get away from the enemy fire. He did this every night. And in the day, if you look and see what did scouts do, by the way, there were only 1 or 2 attached to each unit. In the daylight, the scouts advanced 25 to 50 yards ahead of the advancing line, always with their rifles ready looking down the sights, moving forward as recon and as what it sounds like, a scout. So the Blue Devils were the first American unit into Rome. As Richie said to me, then we slept. He said, we did not sleep. I said, nothing before. He said, how could you? You couldn't sleep. It was just constant action. And they then got forward, and so on June 4th, again, his 18th birthday, they entered Rome. Coincidentally, by the way, this is his daughter's birthday. God works in strange ways. I want to explain how meaningful Rome was. Think about it for just a moment with me. Just imagine Eisenhower at this moment. Normandy has not happened. Eisenhower is sitting over the horizon, off the coast of Normandy. There were 3 days that he could come ashore on the tides. The first one he had already given up. The third one, as it turned out, they couldn't have gone in on. So the second one, he learns 2 days earlier that the Allied troops have broken the Gustav Line and have taken Rome. Now you have to believe that at least for the officer corps, that was a tremendous morale boost. So it was a significant victory in more than just taking Rome and pushing the Germans back. Their job wasn't over. When they finished in Rome, and it doesn't take long to say it, but it took a long time to do it, on July 8th, 1944, they took Volterra. Volterra was such a ferocious engagement that there's a movie made about Volterra too, all by itself. They took it in a day. 2 days later, the Blue Devils took Latico. 2 days after that, they took Villa Magna. Kept pushing the Germans back. They got to the Arno River to the north. Arno River, just look up the Arno River. The word you will see is bitter resistance. The Nazis put up a bitter resistance at Arno. The river is high. The Germans blew up every bridge as they retreated, as they would be expected to do. But that meant that the Americans had to put up pontoon bridges, and they didn't just put people over those bridges. It wasn't like a monkey bridge. When they put artillery over that's as big as half this building. They had enormous pieces of trucks, artillery tanks they had to put across those bridges. And again, if you go back and look at some of the history in the books and in the clips, you'll see, because the river was high, the pontoon bridges washed out. They regularly washed out and they had to be rebuilt again. So they kept moving north, and the Blue Devils again led the charge the entire way. Having broken the Gustav Line, taking Cassino, Rome, they then moved to battles at Mount Battaglia, Mount Capella, and Mount Grande, eventually Verano and up into the Brenner Pass. For Richie's personal involvement in these engagements at Anzio, taking Rome, the Arno River, Appians, and Po Valley, he received the European, African, and Middle East Theater Campaign Ribbons, 3 battle stars, and other medals, eventually the Bronze Star for his heroic service. I have to tell you, Richie, that all of my young years, talking to you in the general store, walking around town, I had no idea that you had done these things. But the record is pretty clear. So, when I asked him this summer, why did you and your 3 brothers go to war? It was very quick in his response. And he said, because it was the end of the world. And we had to go to war. We had to. There was no enthusiasm. There was no question. When they came home, and I think I'm not speaking anything I shouldn't hear, when they came home, they compared notes, the brothers. They all came home. And Richie told his brothers what he had seen and done. And Tink confided to him that none of them had seen that. None of them had done that. And Bunt, his oldest brother, guided him and said, Richie, you need to forget this. You need to really forget this and be active and put it out of your mind. And the gist is that Richie did that, what he was told to do, I think, until this summer, when by chance we were talking about other issues and this percolated up, and it began to percolate out. And a lot of the memory we talked through was really remarkable. So doing the research to confirm the uniqueness of his role in the Blue Devils, what they did to save us all, what he did daily and nightly, and for his courage, for all this and for the things that remain unspoken, we have some letters today. And these letters are really not the product of my work. They are the product of Richie's extraordinary story that when I mentioned I was coming up this weekend to see family members, to a staffer on Bill Cohen's staff, the next thing I knew, I said, could they do a little note or something just to note that he had, just to remember him. He's now in a veteran's home. Next thing I know, Bill Cohen has written a long letter. The next thing I know, I get word that Bill Cohen has purchased a book called Anzio, and he has had it personally inscribed by Secretary Mattis, by himself, by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Ralston, and also by the head of Materials Command, which is, of course, Materials Command was a critical piece of all the involvements in Italy. And so the inscription was given. Next thing I know, I'm told that, wait, don't go yet. We have something else. They just had dinner with General Mattis. General Mattis, Richie wanted to pen a personal letter to you, and he did that sitting down by hand. I have never heard of a Secretary of Defense penning a letter to anyone, maybe another cabinet secretary, but by hand. So I want to read this one first. He also addressed the envelope himself. This is the Secretary of Defense with a lot of things, including North Korea, on his mind at the moment. But he had Richie on his mind, too, as we saw a moment ago, thoroughly as a result of Richie's record. And this is what the letter says. It says, Dear Mr. Lincoln, on the Secretary of Defense's letterhead, Dear Mr. Lincoln, I write to pay you and your brothers in arms the respect of today's U.S. military. There are not words sufficient to describe your generation's devotion to duty in the face of the grimmest circumstances. Nowhere was this more true than for those who led from the front in close combat. You and your comrades set the standard for patriotic commitment. Today's soldiers build confidence from your stoic example, knowing that we will never face anything worse than you overcame. Please accept the respect of all of us in the Department of Defense. Sincerely, Jim Mattis. That was then followed by a letter, a slightly longer letter, but from Secretary and former Maine Senator Bill Cohen. Again, I never spoke with Bill Cohen, so this comes from him as a result of a combination of things. I found some interesting pieces in this, looking back at your record, Richie, and also obviously looking at the conditions surrounding the movement from North Africa to Naples and then further north. He says, Dear Richard, I would like to personally thank you for your military service to the United States of America as a first scout in the 88th Infantry Division's pivotal Battle of Anzio during the Italian campaign of World War II. I would also like to congratulate you on having been awarded the Bronze Star for your heroism. The amphibious landing in which you participated at 17 was grueling, strategically important assault launched against long odds. The transition of your division from North Africa to the cold and wet marshlands surrounded by mountains in Italy presented many environmental and geographic challenges. Despite heavy casualties and epidemic conditions resulting from malaria-carrying mosquitoes, you repeatedly risked your life on the front lines. You demonstrated extraordinary bravery, enduring dangerous enemy fire to launch flares to illuminate enemy weapon batteries. The 88th Division was part of the 5th Army, was the first division to enter a combat zone in World War II. Although it was made up mostly of draftees, you fought so fiercely on your way to capturing Rome that the German prisoners historically remarked that the troops of the 88th were, quote, like devils, unquote, earning the division's name, Blue Devils. The arrival of the 88th on June 4, 1944, certainly a significant day. Not only was it 2 days before Normandy, but it was also your 18th birthday. Many lives were lost on the battlefield at Anzio and many men wounded, but the Blue Devils proved that even under the worst circumstances, the men of the 88th played an integral part in the defeat of the German army in Italy. Your many acts of courage and the troops who served alongside you contributed significantly to the Allies' successful capture of Rome, the ultimate wartime victory, and the assurance of freedom for future generations. It is indeed a privilege and an honor for me to recognize you as one of Maine's true heroes, Richard, and I would like to extend my personal gratitude to you for your unwavering commitment and dedication to our great nation. Sincerely, Bill Cohen. P.S. Thank you for your bravery and your service in handwritten. Last, I want to read what, again, I've never seen anything like this happen before. I'd like to read the inscriptions that were placed in this book by those 4 American leaders. I also want to put a note of realism on all this, which Richie knows, having largely forgotten it for 3/4 of a century, but now having reminded me of it all this summer. The numbers that General Mattis used, 9,000 plus casualties, 2,298 dead of the Blue Devils, come from a total of just 14,000 men. So I did the math when you put it all together, and Richie had a 17.4% chance of getting back here, and 1 in 5, and that is for all of the Blue Devils, not the Scouts. So the fact that he's even here among us is, as he occasionally says, a miracle. He did tell me, and I don't think I'm sharing against a confidence that I shouldn't, that he told me when I asked him how all this happened, he said, I don't really know. He said, I wonder, several times he said to me, I wonder, how did I get home? How did I get back? And then he said to me spontaneously, I prayed every night. I prayed every night just for one more day. And apparently those prayers were heard. So this is the book Anzio, and this book Anzio was purchased by William Cohen for you. No prodding by anybody. This was his doing upon learning of your record. And in the front of this book, the very first page, is an inscription, handwritten again in capitals by Secretary of Defense James Mattis, that says, to Mr. Richard Lincoln, you have the respect and affection of today's military. You and your brothers in arms are the pride of our country. Let me take this opportunity to thank you, underscored, for your courage and sacrifice. With great respect, Jim Mattis, U.S. Secretary of Defense. On the next page, at the top, Paul Kern, General Officer, retired, former head of Materials Command. Mr. Lincoln, you are a remarkable man who was part of the toughest fighting in World War II. The Blue Devils set a standard for all to be measured against. I am grateful for the sacrifices you made as a young man, and thankful you are still with us to receive my thanks. Paul Kern. Then to Mr. Richard Lincoln, your courage, service, and willingness to sacrifice life and limb for our nation makes you a hero to me and the many millions who enjoy freedom in America and abroad. Thank you for all that you have given to us. With great admiration and respect, Bill Cohen. And to Mr. Richard Lincoln, I am deeply grateful for your service to our nation. I have visited Anzio and was truly moved by the sacrifices you and your brave colleagues made during that battle in 1944. With deepest respect, Joe Ralston, General, U.S. Air Force, retired Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, 2000 to 2003. So I really don't have anything to add other than to say, Richie, we are all grateful to you beyond words. We are excited and grateful, I think, that you are here to hear these words. And I just want to say from all of us, and I think I can say for all of us, it is incredible what you've done. And God bless you and thank you.